Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to here. I'm talking today about my Ethiopian flying adventure back in 1974. And as you might know, Ethiopia used to be called Abyssinia. I was so moved back in the 70s that I volunteered my services as a pilot engineer to the Sudan Interior Mission to operate in Asmara, Eritrea, in northern Ethiopia. For some of them might be not be familiar with where Ethiopia is, you can see on the map there where Ethiopia is. It was a very rugged country, volcanic rift valley extending from the northern regions to Somalia in the south. Ethiopia has a checkered history. For this story, I will relate how the Italians invaded in 1896, killing over 17,000 locals before the Ethiopians fought back a guerrilla-type war with an English assistance, winning back in 1941. This is when my aeroplane, the old Cessna 205, you may know a Cessna 205, it's the forerunner of the Cessna 206. The 206 had a 300 horsepower motor, and this one had a 285 horsepower motor. And back in it's a 60s aeroplane. That's it there. And one of my landings, after landing there, the children would all come round. They were fascinating. And this is some of the countryside there in Ethiopia that I flew over. It was pretty rugged. This is just some of the countryside. This, incidentally, is quite an interesting slide. This is a road that the British built up until they beat the Italians back in 1941. The Ethiopians didn't like the Italians. The Italians had come there and they were a bit ferocious to the Ethiopians, and the Ethiopians had the Ethiopians had a unique attitude towards the Italians. If they caught the Italians, they didn't release them, they castrated them and released them. And I'm not sure if they had a rusty knife, but they didn't like it. And while I was out there was a columnist, Quentin Reynolds, and he wrote a poem about the attitude of the Ethiopians towards the Italians. It goes something like this. Now, you all know who Mussolini was, Il Duce, and the poem goes something like this. Il Duce gave the order to march upon the foe, and off to Abyssinia the organ grinders go. But now the war is over, and never more they'll grind. They're back from Ethiopia, where their organs left behind. So, the host returns to home with knickknacks for the mantle, imported straight from Rome. The Pope is inundated with pleas to join the choir from Italians whose normal voices are now an octave higher. El Duce mounts the rostrum on his regiment's return, with the unknown eunuch's ashes in the noble Rome of urn. And what great gift of gratitude this great occasion calls. What can we give our heroes? And the hero shouted, balls. That's some of the countryside that I was operating in there. Every time you landed, the tribesmen came around with their guns. I never ever saw what type they were, but they were quite interesting. This is one of the airstrips I landed there. It was about 450 metres long, and the old Cessna was an old aeroplane, a 60s model aeroplane, so it wasn't particularly overpowered, but still carried 6 passengers, or 5 passengers. This is an interesting photograph. It's each time we landed, the tribesmen all came around. I took a doctor out there one time, and I left her out there for 2 weeks while she was administering to the local tribesmen. Strangely enough, when I got back to Australia, some years later, my daughter was a silver chain nurse, and she was operating in this region And every time she came back, she administered to a doctor here in Perth, and of all things, it was the doctor that was in this picture. She was the one that left out there. I always thought she was a courageous woman, because when I left her out there, I thought, I hope I can get back to you. This is an interesting picture. The guy on the left, the tall guy, is a Texan. His name is Rusty. He came there, and this particular flight in question, he was in the right-hand seat and I was flying out. Now, as you know, the performance of an aircraft is greatly influenced by air density. Such factors as engine performance, air screw efficiency, and aerodynamic qualities and stalling speed depend on air density. In this story, the density altitude increased along with temperature as we were scheduled to take off at 9 o'clock in the morning, and now it was midday. Alas, the power decreased exponentially with the passage of time and could not be accurately measured. The takeoff weight of the combined passengers and load had also increased, so it was a doubtful heart that I started up the little Cessna 205 and taxied out for takeoff at midday. Now you've got to realise I was ready at 9 o'clock in the morning with the 5 passengers and all the gear, and because it was delayed, they delayed me until midday. The temperature climbed, the density altitude climbed, and the engine power went down. So it wasn't a particularly nice position. And the takeoff was at 7,660 feet at Asmara. So as you can see, I never came down below 8,000 feet at any time. In the later model aeroplanes like this, they had an exhaust gas temperature device. It was designed to take the guesswork out of the equation. But this factor was not available in 1970. At that altitude in Asmara, I had to reduce the mixture strength by ear, listening to a rev setting for the best power that I could adjust. You just revved up the motor and you just leaned out the mixture. Now, as you know, you old flyers, if you take off from here, you always take off at full reach. But up there, it wasn't. It was a case of leaning out the best you could hear before takeoff. So I took off from Asmara, and I knew that it was a fairly long runway, but I knew that that red line there was a power line running across my path. So it was a case of Rusty, the Texan, was sitting alongside me for the first flight, and we got airborne. I had 10 degrees of flap down. We got airborne, and the aeroplane was not climbing, and that little vein on the wing goes. The stall warning horn started blowing, and I was trying to milk off flap a degree at a time because I knew this red power line was ahead of me. I had to fly over it. And the control tower called up and said, Alpha Echo Zulu, you're not climbing. And I just kept going, and a bit further down the track, it went blue for about 5 minutes. And the control tower called up and said, Alpha Echo Zulu, you're not climbing. And the stall warning kept blowing, and the Texan alongside me picked up the microphone and said, we'll call you back. Because it was one of those things where you had to pick up the microphone, didn't have a boom mic in those days. So it was a case of, I just managed to just milk me off a degree of flap at a time, and I knew this red power line was coming up. So I just had to keep it above the stall. As I said, it flew for about 5 minutes with a stall warning horn and all sorts of other sphincter muscles cutting washes at the same time. And I finally managed to get over the power line, and everybody in the cabin, I said, whatever you do, don't move. Because, you know, as you pilots know, if you get it unbalanced and something leans around, it takes the weight, the aft CFG, and it's detrimental to your flight. So we finally managed to get over the power line, and went to the the edge of the precipice. There's a big, about 1,000-foot cliff at the end of Asmara. I managed to poke the nose down and climb out. And it was sort of, that's where I got the white hair from. So that's just briefly my story. Thank you.